The credit card reader beeped while tourists paid the HOA to enter my waterfall trail. A teenage volunteer in a green HOA shirt wrapped plastic wristbands around their wrists before letting them pass onto my land. The line stretched past my split-rail fence and down toward the county road. My wooden footbridge shook under people who had no idea they were crossing private property. Beside the gate, a brand-new sign read Waterfall Admission, $15 per visitor, managed by Hollow Ridge HOA. That was the first mistake. The second was placing the booth beside the service road that controlled emergency access to the falls. That road, the bridge, and the trail permit were still under my name. Then I saw the cash box. It was already full. Cold mist from the waterfall drifted through the trees and settled on my jacket. The roar of the water should have been the loudest sound in that hollow. Instead, I heard card swipes, receipt printers, and Diane Holloway's polished voice telling a family from Ohio to enjoy their community attraction. Community attraction. She said it like the word made theft sound clean. I stood near the cedar post with my work gloves still tucked into my back pocket. My boots were muddy from checking the upper drainage culvert that morning. The tourists barely looked at me. To them, I was just another local standing near a trail. My name is Jacob Turner. I am 44 years old, and that waterfall sits inside 118 acres my family has maintained for 3 generations. We never charged people to see it. My grandfather kept the trail open because he believed moving water should be respected, not sold by strangers with clipboards. Diane did not share that belief. She stood under a pop-up canopy with the HOA logo printed on all 4 sides. Blonde hair. White visor. Bright smile. A tablet in one hand and a stack of wristbands in the other. She looked like she was running a charity event, except the money was going into a locked metal box beside her chair. 2 board members guided cars into a makeshift parking area cut across my lower meadow. Orange cones marked spaces in the grass. One minivan had backed over a patch of wild ferns my mother planted years before she passed. I walked toward the booth. Gravel crunched under my boots. Diane saw me coming and her smile sharpened. "Jacob," she said loud enough for the people in line to hear. "We are handling visitor flow today." Handling visitor flow. I looked past her at the wooden trail marker with my family name carved into it. Someone had taped over it with a laminated HOA map. The tape flapped in the damp air. "You are charging admission on my property," I said. The line went quiet. A boy holding a red wristband looked up at his father. Diane laughed softly. Not nervous. Practiced. "The falls serve the whole neighborhood," she said. "People expect organized access." A receipt printed between us. Thin white paper curled from the machine. I watched her tear it off and drop it into a plastic bin marked tourism revenue. That was when the air changed. This was not a mistake. This was a business. And they had built it on land they did not own. Then a state ranger truck turned into the meadow. The ranger truck rolled slowly across the meadow and stopped beside the trail entrance. Dust drifted through the sunlight before settling onto the grass. Every tourist in line looked over. Diane looked over too. Then she smiled and waved as if she had invited him. That caught my attention. The ranger stepped out, adjusted his hat, and looked toward the waterfall. He did not walk to the booth. He did not say a word. He simply stood there for a few seconds, listening to the sound of the water. The roar echoed through the trees. Diane immediately crossed the gravel path to greet him. I could not hear everything they said, but I saw her pointing toward the trail, the parking area, and the crowd of visitors. She was presenting something. Selling something. The ranger nodded once. Then he walked toward the bridge. The old wooden bridge stretched across a narrow gorge before reaching the lower trail. Every board on it had been maintained by my family for years. Fresh mist drifted up from the rocks below. The ranger stopped halfway across and ran his hand along the railing. That railing mattered. A small metal marker sat beneath it. Most visitors never noticed it. Most people assumed it was just another maintenance tag. It was not. The ranger looked directly at it before continuing. That was the second thing that caught my attention. I followed at a distance. The trail curved through tall pine trees and crossed several small drainage channels before opening toward the falls. Families stopped to take photographs. Children pointed toward the water. A few visitors showed off their wristbands like they were entering an amusement park. The sight made my jaw tighten. Then I noticed something else. New signs had appeared along the trail. Not one or two. At least a dozen. Each carried the HOA logo. Each described the waterfall as a community attraction. None mentioned my family. None mentioned private ownership. One sign even included a small map showing future visitor improvements. Observation deck. Expanded parking. Gift kiosk. I stopped reading. Gift kiosk. They were planning much more than admission fees. The ranger continued down the trail until he reached the overlook platform near the falls. Water crashed over the cliff face and thundered into the pool below. White spray filled the air. The platform trembled slightly beneath the weight of visitors. A young couple took selfies beside the railing. Another family opened snacks at a picnic table someone had recently installed. That table had not been there 2 months earlier. Neither had the trash cans. Neither had the directional signs. Someone had been investing money into this place. A lot of money. Diane finally caught up with the ranger and handed him a folder. He accepted it without speaking. Then he opened it and started reading. The crowd kept moving around him. The waterfall kept roaring. The ranger turned one page. Then another. His expression did not change. That somehow made the moment heavier. A few minutes later, he looked up from the folder and asked Diane a question. She answered immediately. Then he asked another. This time her smile faded just a little. Then I noticed a logo printed on the folder. The logo at the bottom of the folder was not the HOA logo. It belonged to a tourism consulting company from 3 counties away. I had seen it before. On resort projects and paid recreation sites. The ranger stared at it for a second longer than the other pages. Then he closed the folder and handed it back to Diane. She accepted it quickly and tucked it under her arm. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the tone of the conversation. Diane was no longer giving a tour. She was explaining something. The ranger looked past her toward the parking area. More vehicles were arriving. A pickup truck pulled in beside a row of SUVs. Another family stepped out carrying cameras and hiking backpacks. The line at the booth grew longer. The cash box changed hands. One HOA volunteer carried it into a small utility shed near the trail entrance. I had never seen that shed used for anything except maintenance tools. Now it had a keypad lock mounted beside the door. That lock was new. I started walking back toward the entrance. The trail was crowded enough that nobody paid attention to me. Visitors stopped to photograph wildflowers. Children pointed at butterflies drifting through the mist. They were not doing anything wrong. Most of them believed they were supporting a legitimate attraction. That was what bothered me most. The deception was not aimed only at me. It was aimed at everyone. Halfway down the trail, I stopped beside one of the new information signs. The sign displayed visitor statistics, trail improvements, and future development plans. Someone had spent money producing it. Professional money. At the bottom sat a small QR code. I pulled out my phone and scanned it. A website opened instantly. The homepage featured drone footage of the waterfall. My waterfall. A reservation calendar filled the screen. Weekend passes. Group rates. Photography packages. Event bookings. My thumb stopped moving. Event bookings. The waterfall was not just generating admission revenue. It was being marketed. The roar of the water echoed through the trees behind me. A family walked past carrying matching wristbands. One little girl asked her mother who owned the waterfall. Her mother pointed toward the HOA logo on the sign. Then they continued down the trail. I stood there for several seconds staring at the screen. Diane had not created a simple ticket booth. She had built an entire business operation. When I reached the entrance again, the ranger was gone. His truck was no longer in the meadow. Diane was back beneath the canopy greeting visitors. The line moved steadily. Receipt after receipt printed from the machine. Then I noticed a clipboard sitting beside the cash register. A stack of forms rested beneath it. At first glance they looked like visitor waivers. Then a name near the top caught my eye. It belonged to a contractor I knew. A contractor who specialized in commercial site construction. I looked closer. Several more names appeared beneath it. None of them were trail guides. None of them were volunteers. Then I saw the project title printed across the top of the page. The project title across the top of the page read Waterfall Visitor Expansion Phase 1. I stared at it while tourists continued filing past the booth. A receipt printer chirped behind me. Somebody laughed near the parking area. The waterfall roared through the trees. Everything sounded normal. Nothing was normal. I kept reading. The document listed grading work, additional parking capacity, viewing platforms, and vendor spaces. Vendor spaces. My fingers tightened around the edge of the clipboard. They were planning food stands, merchandise booths, permanent structures. This was no temporary fundraiser. It was a development project. A man stepped up to the counter and paid for 6 admission wristbands. Diane thanked him and pointed toward the trail. She never looked in my direction. That confidence told me a lot. People hide things when they are worried. Diane was acting like she owned the future. I set the clipboard down exactly where I found it. Then I walked toward the maintenance shed. The new keypad lock gleamed in the sunlight. Fresh concrete surrounded the base of the building. Somebody had upgraded it recently. I circled around the back. The smell of cut lumber drifted from a stack of materials covered by a blue tarp. Pressure-treated boards. Metal brackets. Boxes of hardware. More supplies than any trail maintenance project would need. A small shipping label fluttered in the breeze. Destination: Hollow Ridge Visitor Services. Visitor Services. Another new name. Another new layer. The deeper I looked, the larger this operation became. A pickup truck backed into the loading area. 2 men unloaded survey stakes and measuring equipment. I recognized one of them. His company handled commercial site layouts. He was not the kind of contractor people hired for a few picnic tables. I stepped behind a line of cedar trees and watched. One of the men unfolded a site map across the truck tailgate. The other pointed toward the ridge overlooking the falls. Then toward my meadow. Then toward the bridge. My bridge. The same bridge carrying visitors all day long. The same bridge tied directly to the trail access permit still issued under my name. A gust of wind rattled the branches overhead. Something about that permit kept bothering me. The ranger had looked at the bridge marker. He had studied the folder. He had asked questions that seemed small at first. None of those actions felt accidental anymore. Back at the booth, Diane was speaking with another board member. He handed her a thick envelope. She opened it, counted several sheets inside, then locked it in the cash box. The box was exchanged again. Always moving. Always controlled. I followed it with my eyes until it disappeared into the shed. Then I noticed a white SUV parked beyond the meadow fence. County plates. The driver remained inside. Watching. Not eating. Not hiking. Just watching. A few minutes later, the SUV pulled away without stopping at the booth. That was when I realized other people were paying attention too. Then a volunteer accidentally dropped a stack of receipts near the trail entrance. The receipts scattered across the gravel like playing cards. The volunteer muttered something under his breath and hurried to gather them before the wind carried them away. I moved faster. By the time he reached the last few slips, I had already seen enough. Every receipt carried a transaction code. Every code pointed to the same payment processor. What caught my attention was the business name printed at the bottom. It was not Hollow Ridge HOA. It was Hollow Ridge Visitor Services LLC. I watched the volunteer stack the receipts and rush them back toward the booth. My eyes stayed on the small logo at the bottom. Visitor Services again. The same name I had seen on the shipping label behind the shed. The same name tied to the expansion plans. The pieces were beginning to connect. The waterfall thundered through the trees behind me. Tourists continued crossing the bridge. Children laughed. Cameras clicked. Nobody realized they were standing in the middle of something much larger than a sightseeing trip. I walked toward the lower meadow where the parking area had been carved into the grass. Tire tracks crisscrossed the field. Temporary fencing lined the edge of the trail. A portable restroom sat near the entrance. Every new addition represented money. Real money. Not bake sale money. Not volunteer money. Development money. A man in a polo shirt stood beside one of the contractor trucks talking on a phone. I recognized him from a county planning meeting several years earlier. He worked with commercial recreation projects. He was not someone who appeared unless larger investments were involved. That realization sat with me as I followed the edge of the meadow. Then I noticed something sticking out of a trash barrel beside the shed. A torn envelope. Most of it was buried beneath drink cups and paper towels. One corner remained visible. The logo matched the tourism consulting company from the Rangers folder. I pulled it free. The envelope was empty, but a shipping label remained attached. The destination address belonged to a post office box in another county. The sender was listed as Hollow Ridge Visitor Services LLC. Not the HOA. Not a community fund. An actual company. The air felt cooler beneath the shade of the trees. I folded the label and slipped it into my pocket. Then I returned to the trail entrance. Diane was still smiling for visitors. Still greeting families. Still acting as if this entire operation belonged there. Another receipt printed. Another wristband changed hands. Another $15 disappeared into the system. Then a man stepped up and purchased a group package. Group package. I had not even known those existed until that moment. Diane handed him a brochure. The cover showed an artist's rendering of the falls surrounded by future attractions. Observation decks. Event spaces. Expanded parking. The same plans from the clipboard. The same plans from the website. They were not hiding the project anymore. They were selling it. A gust of wind carried mist from the waterfall across the entrance. Diane turned away to answer another question. That gave me a clear view of the booth table. A ledger book sat partially open beside the cash register. Several pages had folded backward. One entry near the top carried a number large enough to make me stop walking. Then I saw where the money was being transferred. The transfer account name sat at the bottom of the ledger entry. I read it twice to make sure I had not missed something. It was not a community maintenance fund. It was not a trail preservation account. The payment was headed to Hollow Ridge Visitor Services LLC. The same company name kept appearing everywhere I looked. The receipts. The shipping labels. The brochures. The development plans. Every path led back to the same destination. I stepped away before anyone noticed me reading the ledger. The roar of the waterfall rolled through the trees like distant thunder. Visitors continued arriving. More wristbands. More receipts. More money. Diane moved through the crowd with practiced ease. She looked less like a neighborhood volunteer and more like the manager of a commercial attraction. That image stayed with me as I crossed the meadow toward my equipment shed near the upper trail. The air smelled of wet pine and fresh-cut grass. Sunlight filtered through the branches overhead. A hawk circled above the ridge. Everything looked peaceful. The paperwork told a different story. My shed sat beside the old service road that reached the upper drainage channel. The lock clicked open. Inside, shelves lined the walls. Tools. Spare bridge hardware. Trail maintenance records. Decades of work. I walked straight to a weathered metal cabinet in the back corner. Dust coated the top. The cabinet had belonged to my grandfather. He never threw away a map. He never discarded a permit. He kept records for everything. I pulled open the drawer. Rolled survey maps rested inside. Beside them sat binders thick with documents. The smell of old paper filled the room. I carried the first binder to a workbench and opened it. Photographs slid loose across the surface. Trail construction. Bridge repairs. County inspections. Permit renewals. I kept turning pages. Outside, I could still hear faint sounds from the crowd below. A mini-hook settled into my mind. If Diane had built her entire operation around the waterfall, then somewhere there had to be a point where her plans collided with reality. I opened another binder. More records. More maps. Then I found a narrow folder tucked between two larger files. The label had nearly faded away. State access documentation. I stopped. The waterfall itself drew visitors, but access to the site depended on more than scenery. It depended on roads, bridges, trail corridors, maintenance obligations, specific approvals. I opened the folder carefully. Several pages carried county seals. Others carried state markings. A folded map slipped onto the bench. I spread it open. Colored lines crossed the property. Trail routes. Service roads. Protected areas. One section near the bridge had been highlighted years ago. I leaned closer. The notation beside it caught my attention immediately. It referenced a state-managed access agreement connected directly to the bridge crossing. The same bridge now carrying hundreds of paying visitors. My pulse slowed. Not faster. Slower. That always happened when something important surfaced. I checked the next page. Then the next. The documents began fitting together in ways I had not expected. Suddenly the ranger's interest in that small metal marker on the railing made perfect sense. Then I found the page he would probably want to see first. The page carried a state seal across the top and a notation highlighted in yellow decades earlier. I read it once. Then again. The language was technical, but the meaning was simple. The bridge crossing could not be used for commercial visitor operations without specific state authorization. I looked toward the open shed door. Through the trees, I could still hear the steady roar of the waterfall and the distant hum of tourists moving along the trail. Hundreds of people had crossed that bridge. They had paid for access. They had been processed through a ticket system. And all of it appeared connected to a commercial venture. I carefully placed the document on the workbench and opened the next folder. More records. More maps. More correspondence. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. My grandfather had anticipated future disputes long before I was born. Every agreement, every inspection, every modification to the trail system had been documented. One binder even contained photographs from bridge renovations completed nearly 20 years earlier. I flipped through them slowly. Then I found a maintenance inspection report. Attached to it was a copy of the same bridge marker the ranger had examined earlier that day. Suddenly that moment made perfect sense. He had not been casually looking at the railing. He had been confirming something. Outside, a truck engine started near the meadow. Voices echoed between the trees. The operation below continued as if nothing had changed. I gathered the most important documents into a stack. Then I carried them to the cabin office attached to the shed. The small room smelled like cedar, paper, and machine oil. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. I sat down and spread everything across the desk. Maps. Access agreements. Maintenance records. Permit references. The paperwork formed a timeline stretching back decades. A mini-hook settled into place. Every major piece of infrastructure tied to visitor access seemed connected to obligations that extended beyond simple property ownership. That explained the ranger's questions. It also explained why he had grown quieter while reading Diane's folder. I picked up my phone and started photographing pages. One after another. The images needed to be preserved. Several minutes passed. Then my screen lit up with a notification. A local resident had posted photographs from the trail earlier that afternoon. Curious, I opened them. The images showed long visitor lines, the ticket booth, the parking area, and something else. In the background of one photograph stood a temporary banner I had not noticed before. I zoomed in. Visitor Services Grand Opening Event. Next Saturday. My eyes narrowed. Next Saturday. They were not slowing down. They were accelerating. The crowd today was only the beginning. I returned to the paperwork and continued sorting documents into separate piles. Some related to access. Some related to maintenance. Others referenced state oversight. Then I found a contact sheet clipped inside an old correspondence file. Several names appeared on it. Engineers. Inspectors. State offices. One name stood out immediately. It belonged to the ranger who had visited the property that morning. The date on the sheet was older than I expected. Much older. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I realized he had probably seen these records before. The contact sheet remained in my hand while the ceiling fan turned above me. I read the ranger's name again. Then I looked at the date. Nearly 18 years earlier. Long before Diane appeared. Long before the ticket booth. Long before anyone talked about visitor packages or expansion plans. The waterfall roared outside the cabin window. The sound felt different now. Less like background noise. More like a clock counting down. I gathered the documents into a weatherproof folder and headed back toward the trail. The afternoon sun hung lower over the ridge. Shadows stretched across the meadow. Business at the entrance had not slowed. If anything, the crowd looked larger. Another group stepped off a charter bus near the parking area. Charter bus. That was new. Diane's operation was growing faster than I realized. I stopped near the tree line and watched. Volunteers handed out wristbands. Receipts printed nonstop. The cash box disappeared into the shed again. Everything moved with the efficiency of a practice system. Then a familiar truck rolled into the meadow. The ranger. This time he did not park near the entrance. He drove directly toward the maintenance area beside the shed. Several HOA volunteers noticed immediately. Their smiles faded. Diane walked over with quick, confident steps, but the confidence looked thinner than before. The ranger stepped out holding a clipboard. He greeted her politely. No raised voice. No dramatic entrance. Just quiet professionalism. That somehow carried more weight. He looked toward the shed. Then toward the bridge. Then toward the ticket booth. The same sequence as before. Deliberate. Methodical. I stayed back and watched. The waterfall mist drifted across the meadow. A receipt printer chirped again. Somewhere down the trail a child laughed. The ranger asked a question. Diane answered. He made a note on the clipboard. Another question followed. Another note. The conversation remained calm, but something had changed. Diane was talking more. The ranger was talking less. I had noticed that pattern earlier. The less he spoke, the more serious things seemed to become. A contractor emerged from one of the trucks carrying rolled site plans. The ranger noticed him immediately. Another note went onto the clipboard. Then he walked toward the bridge. Visitors continued crossing in both directions. The old planks creaked beneath their footsteps. The ranger stopped beside the small metal marker attached beneath the railing. Again. He crouched this time. He studied it for several seconds. Then he took a photograph. My folder suddenly felt heavier in my hands. Everything pointed back to that marker. Everything pointed back to the access agreement buried in my grandfather's records. Diane followed him onto the bridge. Her smile was gone now. She spoke while pointing toward the falls, the trail, and the growing crowd. The ranger listened without interrupting. Then he asked a single question. Even from a distance, I saw her hesitate before answering. He waited. She spoke again. He looked down at the clipboard and wrote something longer than before. The wind shifted across the gorge. Water thundered below the bridge. Then the ranger turned and asked to see a permit. The question landed harder than any argument could have. Diane blinked once and looked toward the ticket booth. Then toward the shed. Then back at the ranger. For the first time all day, she did not have an immediate answer. The crowd continued moving across the bridge. Wristbands flashed in the sunlight. The waterfall thundered below. The ranger waited. Calm. Patient. He did not repeat himself. He did not need to. Diane finally motioned toward a board member, who hurried toward the shed and disappeared inside. Several minutes passed. Visitors kept arriving. Contractors stood beside their trucks pretending not to watch. The ranger wrote a few notes on his clipboard. The board member returned carrying a folder. Diane opened it and handed over several documents. The ranger read them carefully. One page. Then another. Then another. The longer he read, the quieter the meadow became. Even the volunteers seemed unsure what to do. I stayed near the tree line holding my weatherproof folder. The mist drifted across the grass. A receipt printer chirped once more. Then it stopped. The ranger lowered the documents and asked another question. Diane answered. He asked a second. Her response came slower. Then he opened his clipboard and compared the paperwork to notes he had already taken. That was when I walked forward. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. Diane noticed me immediately. So did the ranger. I handed him the folder from my grandfather's records. He accepted it without a word. The state access agreement sat on top. Beneath it were the bridge records, inspection reports, maintenance documentation, and the highlighted page I had found earlier that afternoon. The ranger opened the folder. He recognized the first document almost instantly. I could see it in his face. He turned pages slowly. Deliberately. Several contractors stepped closer. Board members exchanged nervous looks. Diane folded her arms. The ranger reached the bridge agreement and stopped. Then he looked toward the small metal marker attached beneath the railing. Everything connected in that moment. The bridge. The permit references. The access requirements. The commercial operation. The visitor business. The expansion plans. The ranger closed the folder and took a long breath. Then he spoke quietly with Diane for several minutes. Nobody else could hear the conversation over the sound of the water. When they finished, Diane's expression had completely changed. The confidence was gone. The volunteers began removing signs from the trail entrance. Wristbands disappeared from the table. The cash box was carried away. Tourists were no longer being stopped at the bridge. Families simply walked through. A contractor rolled up a site plan and returned it to his truck. One by one, the pieces of the operation started disappearing. No shouting. No dramatic scene. Just reality catching up with paperwork. By sunset, the booth stood empty. The bridge remained open. The mist drifted through the gorge exactly as it always had. I stood beside the railing while the last visitors crossed toward the falls. Nobody paid a fee. Nobody needed a wristband. The waterfall sounded different that evening.